So I'm going to talk about what sexual objectification is and then what people perceive it to be. So I've opened up this page here. So it's a Wikipedia page. It's a pretty reliable source at the end of the day. And according to Wikipedia, sexual objectification is defined as the act of treating a person as an instrument of sexual pleasure. And it goes on, Wikipedia goes on then to more broadly define objectification as treating a person as a commodity or an object without regard to their personality or dignity. So after reading this Wikipedia's definition, I can already see a problem with how today people seem to see sexual objectification. They don't see it as this definition. A lot of people see sexual objectification as finding something attractive. And you can see this today, especially in commentaries about media from a lot of left-wingers. They tend to think that if there's something attractive in this media, the first thing it is sexual objectification. Regardless of what that person does, how they do it, if they're good at the job that they did, or if they're portrayed just as a joke. And that's a huge problem. Because not only are they deciding to just redefine the word, they're also telling people that if they find something attractive, that is bad, and that they are bad for doing that. So, sexual objectification, as defined by Wikipedia, and probably the dictionaries as well, would be a situation for, let's say, you're working, you're at your job in this corporate kind of cubicle environment, and one of your coworkers walks down the aisle next to your cubicle, and you reach out, you slap their ass, and you say, "Hey, looking good today." That would be Wikipedia's definition of sexual objectification. And because Wikipedia's definition of sexual objectification also encompasses the modern-day layman's view of sexual objectification, that situation, it's both of those definitions view that as sexual objectification. But let's say in the same environment, your coworker walks down the aisle, and you see them, and you think they're attractive, and let's say you have this little fantasy about slapping their ass, and then it goes, who knows, it goes all 50 shades of gray, and then you tie them up and whatnot. People would also view that as sexual objectification, and this is where Wikipedia and modern-day feminists and modern-day academics, this is where they divide. And this is where shit gets really, really fucked up. Because you're telling people, you can't think that. Thinking that is wrong. And when you tell someone that they're committing thought crime, you're getting dangerously close to fascism. You're getting dangerously close to 1984 and Big Brother. And at the end of the day, no one wants that. And I don't think any of these people who have basically redefined the word or the meaning of sexual objectification really understand how dangerous that idea can be. Because as soon as you convince people that policing their thoughts is normal, you can go so much further, and it's such a slippery slope. It can go downhill so fast. And we're not really seeing any of that Orwellian society shit today, but what we are seeing is the effects, the mental health effects of people being told what they think is bad, and that they're evil, and that they shouldn't be thinking that. And what that is leading to is a huge mental health problem with men today. It's leading men to have depression, it's leading to suicide rates that are going up every year, despite mental health being treated as more seriously every year and being taken more seriously and having more options available for those suffering from mental health issues. Despite that all increasing, suicide rates are also increasing. And it's also leading to a huge part of men today who are just deciding to give up on relationships and give up on women and basically seclude themselves from society. And there's a nice article on this website called Breitbart. And I don't really care for the political leaning of any paper or any article, as long as it provides facts and makes logical conclusions with the fact. And this makes some very logical conclusions, I find, this article. And so what this article is, at the beginning, is an interviewer talking to a German kid named Rupert. That's the first part of this article. And Rupert is a self-proclaimed video game enthusiast, and that really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what he likes. It doesn't matter what he jacks off to. It doesn't matter what he drives. The part that he's a video game enthusiast should be completely ignored. The only important part is what he feels that society is going right now. And he says marriage is dead and divorce means you're screwed for life. And I know in the US, it's something close to less than a third of all men win custody battles, regardless of the situation. Women almost always have an advantage in custody battles. And so he says marriage is dead, divorce means you're screwed for life. And then he says women have given up on monogamy. And so to dumb that down is basically saying women have given up on long-term relationships. Women have decided to go for casual sex more so than a long-term relationship. And so this definitely came about with second wave feminism. And so this idea of casual sex not being a bad thing came about probably in the 70s and the 80s. And, well, casual sex, it's true. Having your sexual freedom is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But what's bad is when people decide to not settle down. Because, sure, there are some people who don't want to settle down and don't have kids. But there's a lot of people who may want to settle down and have kids, but then they're being told, no, you've been given your sexual freedom, go do whatever you want, go fuck anybody. And while it's okay to have your sexual freedom, it's not okay to be irresponsible with it. Because when you're irresponsible with your sexual freedom, you can damage other people's relationships and you can ruin lives. And you can also spread venereal diseases. Like, we don't need any more venereal diseases being spread. It's not a good thing. And Rupert goes on to say, because monogamy is dead, because women have seemingly given up on it and only gone for casual sex, it makes it uninteresting for men who want serious relationships or who want to have a family. That option just is not there more often than not for men now because of this rise in casual sex. And he says, now that's just the way it is. And he says, even if we take the chances in having a family and raising kids, if we ever have a dispute or want to get a divorce, there's a good chance that the kids won't go to the guy, like I mentioned about custody battles. Then he pointed out this whack job thing. Apparently in France, you still have to pay child support for a child, even if the child was born out of an affair that your wife had. That is just nuts. That's a whole other thing. That's France's problem. But then he says, in school, boys are screwed over again and again. And he says schools are engineered for women. And when he says that, it links to another article. This article is called Eliminating Feminist Teaching Bias Erases Boys' Failing Grades. Study finds. And so I'm gonna just browse this lightly. And it says, some writers are beginning to connect the dots between the shift over the last few decades in education practices from fact-based grading to evaluation-based grading on non-cognitive and emotional skills. And so what that boils down to, what they're stating is people are starting to grade more so from feels and not reals. They're saying emotion is more important than fact. And I'm just reading about this, see if this is if this is valid in any way, or if they're just, puffing hot air. And so it says this study was a 5-year research project by the Department of Education and Justice in Northern Ireland. So these two articles I have are European articles. They're not in America or North America, but I don't think really it's going to change that much when you cross the continents. But they say at the conclusion of their 5-year project, they've released some info saying that they found systemic flaws in the way students are evaluated that leave boys disadvantages. And he says this, I don't know who it is, but they say boys from poor neighborhoods in larger cities are much more vulnerable to learning underachievement and health problems. And so 2 people who are part of this research thing, Ken Harland and Sam McCready of the University of Ulster, I hope I said that right, they said this problem had been obvious, this gender gap had been obvious for what they say is several decades, quote unquote several decades, but they couldn't find specific strategies for finding out why boys were underachieving. And they said even though that all the teachers they interviewed seemed to know that the boys weren't doing as well as the girls, none of them thought anything of it. So that just shows how ingrained it is in our society now to see boys as dumber. And this problem is still apparent even in primary schools, even in your like grade 1, grade 2 class. So that's actually really bad. It's like this issue of underachievement is seen from primary school all the way up to secondary school. I don't know what that counts as. Maybe junior high, high school, middle school, high school. And it says the ratio of males to females graduating from a 4-year college are constantly declining. And that in 2003, in Northern Ireland, there were 135 females for one every 100 males who graduated from a 4-year college. So that's a pretty huge gap. So this does look like a good argument. It doesn't just look like they're blowing smoke. This is a study, it seems well researched, and they make some pretty logical conclusions at the end of it. So it does seem that at least in some places, schools seem to be engineered for women. Not everywhere, but in some places. So this is part of Rupert's little thing when he said men are checking out of society and checking out on women. And he mentioned that school thing, and that school thing seems to be completely valid. And then he also mentions that in the US, they force feed Ritalin like Skittles to little boys. And if you don't know what Ritalin is, think Adderall as its prescription use, like something to combat ADHD and to help people focus. This kind of drug is given to young boys. Not like 13-year-old, like young. I know someone who was prescribed Ritalin and they actually needed it, but the people that they're talking about here are kids that maybe run around a little bit in class and like when they're 5 and they're being prescribed Ritalin. So basically what Rupert's saying is a lot of things are engineered against men in today's society, and some things just aren't favorable for men. It's not some kind of reverse, it's not male privilege we're seeing here. It's that, which really, it's not a thing. Male privilege isn't a thing unless you want to make it a thing. And if you make it a thing, you also need to account for female privilege, but I'm not gonna fucking talk about that. That's too long to talk about. Rupert also talks about how his generation seems to have less total wealth than the previous generations that have lived. He's saying that there's less total money to go around. And he's saying that even though schools are engineered against men, he's saying people are fleeing back into higher education to stave off unemployment and poverty. So what he's saying is probably something that's contributing to the reason why there's so many degrees you can get, and why universities in a lot of places aren't seen as an opportunity more so than a place to get a piece of paper. Because he's saying everyone who can't find a job is just going back to universities and colleges to maybe get a degree so maybe they can get another job. And that causes a huge problem, because then you have this huge inflation of people with degrees, and then you have people who want the job, and then there's this guy with 1 degree who may be more qualified than the guy with 4 degrees. Even though the guy has 4 degrees, he should be more qualified. So what people do is they'll hire the guy with 4 degrees, and then that leads to next time they think about having that job offer, they decide, oh, how about we put you need more degrees on it. And so at the same time, universities become a degree mill because people keep coming back and jobs are increasingly more difficult to get into. And so you have this sort of like squared relationship where it's like money is work divided by 2 or something, and you have to work like way harder than you will to ever get your effort come back to you. And anyway, so at the end of this little intro to this full article, which it looks like a good article, I read it earlier. Basically, the end of the first part of this article makes a comparison between men today and this study done in the 60s about a mice utopia and the effect it had on the mice population. And so what this thing was, this is so interesting. It was this researcher built this enclosure for mice, and this enclosure was designed to be a mice utopia. It had little nesting areas, it had like nesting area neighborhoods, it had a feeding area, it had different feeding areas, it had bathing areas, I think it even had slides. And then what this guy did is he put a male mouse and a female mouse in. Just one pair, I think. or it was like 2 or 3 pairs. It wasn't a lot. It was just enough to populate this entire thing. And there was this, the scientists watched this trend of the mice population going up and up and up and up and up, and they're like, well, what's going to happen? Is it going to stop? Is it going to self-regulate? And so the population just plateaued and then just dropped. Everything died. No one reproduced after it plateaued. And what people saw was the moment it plateaued or became overpopulated, there was the male mice and the female mice basically segregated themselves, and there was male mice that all they do all day is eat, sleep, and groom, and then repeat. And the female mice, I don't know, they'd just hang around. And then there was some mice that would just go nuts, and they'd like fuck anything that moved or didn't move. And then there would be like mouse riots, and mice would eat themselves. And it was just the mouse society fell apart after the plateau. And then it never went back. It just, everything died after. And so the generation of mice that all they did was groom themselves was the beautiful ones. And Rupert, this kid who says men are checking out on women and life and societies, he says our generation is the beautiful ones. And so that parallel there is really scary, because I don't think society will devolve into this like warmongering, this riot society, but something's going to happen, especially with this huge push in academia for progressiveness for the sake of being progressive, and people redefining what rape is, and people redefining what feminism or sexism and racism is so it fits their narrative. This is going to have some huge ramifications 20 years from now. And even though at the start of this little thing I talked about what sexual objectification is and how people perceive it to be, and what the differences are, and how it basically at the end is telling people what you think is not okay, it's going to get to that point, or at least a lot of people want it to get to that point. And a lot of these people may actually be like, they may have well intentions, and they may actually just want to end racism, but there's a lot of people here who are really abusing this movement for their own gain, like politicians, and I think there's almost definitely a game developer or two who abuse feminism and things, buzzwords like sexual discrimination, to kind of sneak in there, and maybe even if they don't have a good game or whatnot, they can use it to shut the masses up. Because at the end, no one wants to be called some sort of misogynist rapist and is demonized for what they think. No one wants that to happen, so everyone just shuts up and goes with it. But yeah, sexual objectification, if we go all the way back to the beginning, what we think it is and what it actually is are different things. What a lot of people think sexual objectification is just the act of finding something attractive, not even acting on it. Just like if you see a woman and you find it attractive, that's sexual objectification. That's what a lot of people view it as, even though that's not what sexual objectification is. It's that and more, and the more part's so much more important than the sexy part. The sexy part of sexual objectification is probably the least important part of sexual objectification. The objectification part is the important part. That's the damaging part. That's the part that people should actively try to push off and stop. But people aren't. They're focusing on the sexual part. And that's going to have some problems with mental health later in the long run. It's going to lead to people just hating themselves for who they are. It's already happening now. And it makes people scared. It makes me scared of what's going to happen in 20 to 30 years from now.